The Dr. Duke Show coming to you from Southie. Despite a $40 billion tax endowment, Harvard is still sending employees away without pay and blaming the virus. How wicked awesome of you, Harvard. Progressive values for thee, not for me. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is the Southie version of the Dr. Duke Show. Wicked, wicked awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the country, Harvard. We're going to be on the yard. More specifically, LGBTQ campus activists protest restrictions on religious freedom at a clinic at Harvard. This while a Harvard conference sets up to attack homeschoolers. Plus, we'll then get to some real, serious education with Sir Walter Raleigh's instant classic poem, Even Such Is Time. But we start in Massachusetts, baby, where the prestigious institution with a $40 billion endowment says it must lay off non-essential workers amid the coronavirus pandemic. You got that right. 40 billion cheddar, because you can't dip into that 40 billion, to actually pay people during the time of suffering. You got to stick it to the man.
That's right. They're not going to give that cheddar to the ones who actually cut.
Cheddar.
The cheddar. Okay, you can say the cheddar.
The Cheddar Bay biscuits, baby.
They're cutting the subcontracted dining hall workers without pay, as obviously we know coronavirus and the university itself is not open. So the move is drawing criticism from employment rights advocates on and off the campus who point to this. It's not just 40 billion, it's 40.9 billion dollar endowment. As evidence that the school is hardly in any financial straits, they claim that the decision violates Harvard's wage equality policy, which requires the university to compensate dining hall contract workers in a fashion comparable to the school's directly hired employees. It's so sad because Harvard has billions upon billions, and you'll say how many cheddars that is, and yet they can't help the workers who actually need the money the most, while the professors who are sitting up in their cozy little libraries that they have in their own homes, they are able to still get paid. And the ones who actually do the work are not. And we know this is true across the country, but especially when it comes to the largest endowment of any university, Harvard.
I mean, this show is really just an I told you so. Are you surprised, America, that with $40.9 billion in the bank, are you surprised? Nobody's surprised by this. And I'm sure with enough bad publicity, Harvard will reverse this. Take that 0.9. Keep the 40 billion.
Yeah, just take the 0.9.
Take that 0.9 and just take the interest from that 0.9. Yeah. And you can make this go away, right? So Harvard, I assume they'll get their act together and do the right thing. But again, you have to be reminded of this. These progressive institutions are progressive when they're lecturing you. When they're like Hollywood, these universities. I'm going to have my private planes. I'm going to have my 40 billion in the bank. I'm going to eat lobster in the cafeteria every night. I'm going to do that. But you, for the sake of the environment, for the sake of the world, for the sake of equity and inclusion, you, little man, can't do any of it.
I will keep my clam chowder, too.
Chowder.
Chowder. Well,
you got to drop your R's, kid.
I can't.
It's not chowder. It's chowder.
Chowder. I can't do it. I'm not. Anyway, back in 2018, the New York Times, but anyway, reported that the university dining hall had 275 subcontractors. So they did math. Based on a local living wage standard, it would cost Harvard about $710,000 to provide 4 weeks of full-time paid leave for all of these dining workers. That equates to 0.001% of Harvard's endowment.
Yes, and I guarantee you they're Harvard. Could they get a federal grant to cover that? Bet you they could. Are they going to be snuffleupagussing up to the trough of coronavirus relief to get more money for the university? You betcha.
You bet. Now you're coming back home.
Betcha.
You betcha.
See, you dropped it.
You betcha. That's our land. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you betcha.
Yeah.
Well, we also have the Harvard LGBTQ activists in the form of the Lambdas. Lambda. The Lambdas at Harvard got a little feisty after they found out that Harvard Law School Curriculum Committee met and they proposed having a religious freedom clinic. This would be part of the law school, okay? So Harvard Law School's talking about let's get this freedom Religious Freedom Clinic, which is a legal clinic that would focus on cases involving the rights of individuals to practice their religion.
And I'm sure when Harvard was doing this, they were thinking about protecting Muslim rights and the rights of atheists, protecting Jewish rights. I'm seriously doubting that Harvard was all about let's protect them evangelicals.
This is true. So the group of the Lambda, let's keep calling them the Lambda. They talked to the dean, Dean Manning, whether this proposed clinic would engage in work that seeks to abridge the civil rights of or otherwise discriminate against LGBTQ plus people. And citing the principle of academic freedom, Dean Manning refused to directly respond to Lambda's question. So what does Lambda do? Well, first they wrote a letter to the dean seeking a guarantee that if this clinic was opened, that it would not weaponize religious freedom to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people or jeopardize reproductive justice.
And what Lambda is basically saying is you can protect religious freedom as long as it gets in the way of abortion, doesn't get in the way of abortion, and as long as it doesn't condemn the lifestyles of LGBTQers. So religion's fine as long as it agrees with us. Mm-hmm. You can defend religious rights to the degree that the new God of the country, LGBTQ, and abortion, the sacrament of the new gods of America, as long as you worship that particular specific religion and the other religions you protect never say or utter a word against those things, we, the LGBTQ mafia, will allow you to have Professor Manning, only if you change your name, by the way, to Professor Personing. Yep. Only then will we allow you, Harvard, to go along with this plan.
Yes. Well, this all happened back in November, and nothing came from it. So what does Lambda do? Now it's time to rally together. And so at the end of February, then they took to be outside the main law building on the campus, and they hand-delivered the rally signs that they made to Dean Manning because they could have been in class, but who needs to do that when you could be doing this? So Lambda actually wrote, in sum, Harvard Law School is ignoring and dismissing its most valuable resource, its student body, by remaining silent over the numerous and deafening calls for more transparent, honest, and frequent communication. Prioritizing concepts of academic freedom without defining what it might look like or who leading this clinic would exercise that freedom leaves the LGBTQ plus community at this institution and beyond more vulnerable.
Yeah, so just like with their endowment, 0.001% of the student body ought to get its way and be able to override your freedom of religion. Look, at this point, Harvard, there would be less controversy if you just created a Second Amendment Center. I promise you, if you just had go to the trial, I know you'll never do it, but create a Second Amendment Center, right?
Stop it.
There'll be less trouble than there would for protecting the rights of religious people in the yard.
In short, at the end, Lambda says to Dean Manning and to the law school administration, communicate, don't discriminate. Pow.
Yeah, and I wish wish Dean Manning would have said what one of those Cambridge or Oxford's Don said to the environmentalists. I can't do what you ask, but I can turn off your electricity. What she could have said is that you guys go up and sign up. You LGBTQers, you go ahead and make a church, the Church of LGBTQ, and worship this flying gay spaghetti monster. Then we'll protect you. But until then, this is none of your business. We're now going to turn to Alex Newman for our next story. Alex, this is an alarming story in many respects. It's a Homeschool Summit. It's called Problems, Politics, and Prospects for Reform that is going to be held at Harvard University, according to the law school. The Harvard University Law School is going to host this June 18th and 19th. And the entire premise of this symposium is that government owns kids, not families, and that we've got to reform, if not eliminate, homeschooling opportunities for moms and dads across the country.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Duke. It's a so-called summit designed openly to wage war on educational liberty, homeschooling, and parental. The two key organizers, you have Professor Elizabeth Bartholet of Harvard University, the founder of the Child Advocacy Program, and she argued even recently in a law review journal that there ought to be a presumptive ban on homeschooling, and that anybody who was allowed to homeschool, then the parents would have to prove to the government that that would be okay. So complete reversal of the way we do things now. The other main organizer, Professor Dwyer out of William and Mary Law School, he says that parental rights are in our imaginations. There are no such thing as parental rights. He says the parent-child relationship only exists because the state confers maternity and paternity on parents through the laws. So this is the mindset that these people are coming from, and they're trying to move the Overton window, right? So on the one hand, you have the ban homeschooling outright, and then the more moderate people are the ones who say we just need much, much heavier regulation of homeschooling. Nowhere do we have people who say, hey, actually, parents are the ones who ought to be overseeing of the education of their children, and that should be the norm. It's a very, very scary attack, Duke, on fundamental, God-given, protected human rights.
What we know, and we saw this with the gay marriage agenda, we saw this with the LGBT agenda broadly, more broadly we're seeing it now with the transgender agenda, is that they demand everything knowing they won't get it. And then the compromise is to, we won't today, right now, ban it altogether. We're just going to radically reform it and subject it to major government oversight. So 2 years from now, when all those laws and legislation's in place, then you move to get rid of it altogether. This is the plan from progressives about 150 years now. We've seen this from them. And what really gets me, Alex, is this idea that we're doing this on behalf of the children. We're advocating for children. What is their argument? Not parents. Parents don't have rights, as you just said. But we want to make sure that every American school kid gets a public school education. If you're not giving your kid a public school education, say these educrats, you are depriving them of an actual education. And how many times have you and I sat here and discussed the failed public schools? Explain to me, Alex, how they can, in good faith, make the argument. We see how we're failing our public school kids. Most of them can't read at grade level. We got 2 and 3 years behind on the NAEP scores where they should be in English, reading, and math. The schools are a complete travesty of radical sexual education and politics, lack of oversight. It's just a complete mess. In what world can they argue that the students, if they're not getting this crappy public school education, are actually suffering?
It really requires them to twist themselves into pretzels. It's actually quite interesting to see because the data is very clear. Homeschoolers do, on average, far better than the victims of the government schools. I mean, on average, they're scoring 15, 30, 40 percentile points higher than the victims of the government schools on the government's own academic achievement tests. They do better on every trackable metric that we have for socialization. They do better as adults. They get better jobs. They start more companies. They do less drugs. Their marriages last longer. I mean, on every front, homeschoolers do better than the victims of government school. But what's really troubling to me, Duke, is I've seen all this before. I was living in Scandinavia in 2012 when the Swedish government decided to ban home education. That's also, by the way, when they decided that all so-called private schools had to teach the government's curriculum. And they were using the exact same language that we are seeing now from these totalitarians at Harvard. Elizabeth Bartholet, one of the organizers at Harvard Law School, she's contrasting homeschooling absolutism, as she puts it, versus the children's right to an education. Well, guess what? This is exactly the same language that the Swedish government used. So I wrote articles in probably a dozen publications around the world. They were read on Fox News about what happened in Sweden. And when I called the education ministry over and over and over again, the response I got was the children have a right to an education. And what they mean is the children have a right to be brainwashed by the government. Mm-hmm. They don't have a right to get a proper education from their parents at home. So it's a complete reversal of reality. Even the United Nations actually recognize that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that should be provided to their children. But now we're entering a new era. They know that homeschoolers make the government schools look terrible because here we are, we're providing our children with an amazing education. We do it for, on average, like $500 a year, and the kids are beating the pants off the victims of government schools. They've got to shut it down because it exposes the fraud that is the government school system, and that's why they're in a panic. That's why they're going this route.
Well, and the one thing we didn't answer, it was kind of a rhetorical question, wasn't it, Alex? Because we recognize that it's not math and science and reading and literacy and history that we're talking about here. If those were still the standards by which the public schools operated, giving your kids an actual academic education, there would be no argument. Hands down, this is stupid. Homeschool wins. But you and I both know, and anybody who watches this show knows, that what the educrats are talking about is homeschool parents aren't teaching their kids that transgenderism is a thing. They're not getting 3-year-olds to question their own gender. They're not replacing traditional male and female pronouns with all these goofy new invented pronouns. They are not turning out little Greta Thunbergs. Take a look at speaking of Sweden, right? What little Greta became under Swedish educational policy, right? Little activists. They are not advancing Planned Parenthood homeschool parents or the LGBTQ agenda and their homeschooling. They're not telling kids everything's relative. They're giving kids an education based in factual academic subjects, not all of this left-wing globalism. And that's what Bartlett and that's what Harvard's doing. We own your kids. They don't belong to you. They are citizens of the world. Our job in public schools is to brainwash and reformulate your kids along the line of globalists. It has nothing to do with anything else. If you understand that, then you understand what they're doing.
Yeah, you're so right, Duke. That's exactly what's going on here. And, we need to fight this with every fiber of our being. I mean, they are now coming for the most sacred, the most fundamental rights that a human being can have, the relationship, the bond between a parent and a child. This is where we need to draw the line and say, absolutely not. You've already got 85% of the children that you're destroying. We will not let you go one step further. We've got to stand up against this. Harvard won't allow anybody to come in. It's an invitation only, so we're not even allowed to come in and report on it. But this is the agenda that they are setting, that they are pushing. We need to be aware, and we need the homeschool community and even non-homeschoolers to recognize that our rights are at risk. We have got to stand firm.
Harvard University deserves a lot of blame here, Harvard Law School, for hosting a conference whose primary aim is the same aim that the Nazis had in World War II when they banned homeschooling, to form citizens that were conforming to the state, young citizens that would betray their parents, young citizens who weren't getting a serious education in academic subjects but were being groomed to become the new Nazis, the new soldiers on behalf of the Reich. This is exactly what Harvard's hosting, something moving in exactly that direction. And we've got to ask the question, why would Harvard host such a one-sided conference? There is no pretense, no pretending, no inviting of people from the other side. This is a how do we ultimately find a way to phase out homeschooling?
Alles ist nicht so gut. All right, well, we're going to take a look at some real education.
And it's instant classic time, a place where we can help you, mom and dad, homeschool with a little bit of education for this afternoon.
Back in the 16th century, men had played many different roles, and Sir Walter Raleigh was one of those men.
Renaissance man.
A Renaissance man. He spent much of his time as an English landed gentleman. He was a soldier. He was a politician. He was an explorer who famously looked for El Dorado, the lost city of gold. He was also a spy, a courtier, a writer, and a poet. And his such time, hint, hint, came to an end on October 29th, 1618, with his beheading in London for allegedly conspiring against King James I.
Yeah, he almost
talk about that.
Raleigh was one of Elizabeth's boys, right? The Virgin Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. She had a host of beautiful young men, courtiers, who danced attendance. The Earl of Essex was one of them, and Sir Walter Raleigh was another. And Raleigh spent a lot of the Queen's money exploring and attempting to colonize parts of the New World. He never did turn in the big gold stash that they hoped, but he brought enough wealth back to the kingdom that, despite her reservations, Elizabeth never did formally cut his head off. But after Elizabeth died and King James of Scotland came down to become James I of England in 1603, Raleigh was freed from prison. He was allowed to go out and do some more work, try to colonize a little bit, bring a little bit more money back to England from the New World, and ran afoul of James. And interestingly, he spent a lot of time in jail before James took his life, cut his head off. Among the things that he actually did while he was in jail, believe it or not, was to write a history of the world. He didn't finish it, obviously. It was sort of cut a little. It was cut a little short, but it's one of the really amazing things. You read what Raleigh's history of the world, starting from the beginning all the way up to as far as he got. It's a really compelling read, very well done. But on the eve of his own beheading, he knew he was going to get his head cut off, and so on the night before they dragged him out of his cell and took him to the scaffold and took his head, he actually wrote this little poem. Show it to him. It's called "Even Such Is Time." And what a beautiful poetic reflection, again, on the brevity of human life and on what we as Christians can hope for beyond the grave. It goes like this. Even such is time, that takes in trust our youth, our joys, and all we have, and pays us but with age and dust, time. who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days. So if you look at those 6 lines, those 2 triads, right? Time, what does time do? Time takes our youth, our joy, the vigor and vitality of the early years of our life. It takes all we have and ultimately pays us back with nothing but age and dust. And then the second triad of lines, time, and after we're dead, she doesn't leave us alone. Time, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days. What seems to be a big, important story, oh gosh, look who died today, right? Really, he died. And then in a couple months, we don't remember that he even lived, right? Time does that as well. But in the closing couplet, Raleigh does something beautiful, right? I'm going to start from the beginning and I'll go through the end. Even such is time, that takes in trust our youth, our joys, and all we have, and pays us but with age and dust, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days. But out from this earth, this grave, and this dust, my God shall raise me up, I trust. Right? That the one thing bigger than time. And if you ever get a chance to really study Renaissance poetry, we'll do a lot of it on our instant classic period. But if you get a chance to study the Renaissance period, what I love about it is time is the enemy. The big enemy to all things human is time. Time, of course, is a consequence of the fall of man. Before Adam and Eve, God lives in a timeless world, right? God is not bound by linear time. He's beyond time. Timelessness is God. Time is our curse. It may be even a bigger curse for us than death is, when you stop and think about it. And Raleigh's poem says, okay, right? He's an older man now his life is spent, his youth is spent. He's going to be dead in about 6 hours. But he knows that my God will lift me up, I trust, from out of that dust. So a nice poem on what really matters.
And that's going to do it for another week here at the Dr. Duke Show in isolation. For those of you with kids, just a reminder that Freedom Project Media is releasing 2 daily animated education videos on our Facebook page. We highlight a new American president every day at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time and one of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence at 2 p.m. So gather the kids and do a little homeschooling with Freedom Project.
And just a quick reminder that despite millions of children being ordered to stay at home from school, Freedom Project Academy students have not missed a class day. If you have a student in K-12, take a look at our Judeo-Christian live online classes for next fall. Request your free information packet at freedomforschool.com, freedomforschool.com. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie. And until next time, dream beyond dust, my friends.